and a very good afternoon where I am at the moment to everyone who's joining us from different parts. I see so many of my own friends and colleagues here that I know. And so instantly I feel quite relaxed and at home, and I'm hoping for us to have a good conversation. My task today is just to briefly, I think, tease out some ideas in the little time that we have. And then maybe we could look at a quick exchange, a sharing of ideas, because I see so many of us here passionate about sharing the gospel. Now, we are commanded in Scripture to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. And the often daunting question is how do we present the gospel to our contemporaries in a meaningful way, in a way that makes sense, right? In one way, we want to make sure that what we say is the gospel, and we want to make sure that what we say remains with its integrity, or keeps it and maintains its integrity. Because if we add or subtract from it, then we lose possession of the goodness of the good news, and the gospel ends up with no power to save. While on the other hand, if we only speak it in a way that makes sense to us, then we end up also with a gospel that that makes sense to us who are already converted, right? And we have not really proclaimed what the message is. And so in any case, our message, the gospel message, is eternal. But our methods can always take the form of the people that we are trying to reach. An important question about the message taking the form of the people or the groups that we're trying to reach is understanding where people are located. Who are our contemporaries? Who are the people that we're trying to speak to as we communicate this passionate message to? Who are we preaching to? And I think an important aspect of that is where are they located? And so I'd like to frame this part of the conversation, at least in our discussion, as thinking through the context through which, or the broader context that describes maybe the 21st century, only in part. We don't have time to describe it holistically, and neither do I think have the skills to do so, but I will do my best at least to frame it within these three words: the globalized, privatized, and mediatized world, as a strategic context for preaching the gospel in the 21st century that answers the question, where are the people located? And hopefully highlight a few of these challenges and opportunities, therefore, for the gospel. In a globalized world, there are few revolutions that we can think about that have really shaped our world, the 21st century. The digital revolution means that we communicate, or there is a rapid exchange of data and ideas across the globe, right? We're able to communicate at rapid speeds because of the digital revolution. So a rapid exchange of data and ideas. But also then together combined, the transport and digital revolution means that there is enhanced mobility of individuals, and there's a creation of a new global public sphere that would not suffer from the same geographic and temporal time constraints as the spheres, or public spheres in the 20th century. So there's a converging of space and time thanks to a transport and digital revolution. The economic revolution speaks to us about how trade is integrated across between continents, creating again a global transnational supply chain. And the link here between trade and ideology could be put simply that in many spaces today, in order to follow the ideas, one has to follow the money. And so it's important for us to understand, therefore, what the economic revolution is as people who are in a space where we are sharing the good news, and we are engaged in storytelling. And of course, the big data and the fourth industrial revolution has meant that there's been a rapid development of this thing that we call the cyber domain, or otherwise known as the cyber space, which encompasses all interactions truly today, or many interactions, let me say, in many different parts of the world, activities, transactions between individuals, between communities, between states and other non-state organizations and corporations as well. So truly these, to understand this, or what's shaped this globalized world, is to understand as well the different types of movements, the different types of revolutions, if you want to call them, that have contributed to this. And then secondly, the second feature of the strategic context of our world is the privatized, or to think about the world as being privatized. Now, there are two ways in which we can talk about this. There are many, but two that I like to, but I'll only focus on one. The one that I'm not going to focus on is to think about a privatized world being a world where those who normally would provide services and with certain goods, if you like, those who have a monopoly on being service providers, in a privatized world, this changes, where you've got non-traditional actors, not people who don't usually provide some of these services and goods, entering that, and there's a delegation of responsibility that can take place. In a sense, there is a partnership, there's a wider partnership, where some of it good, some of it bad. And for instance, you can talk about today where, I don't necessarily have to, read my Bible. There are apps. There's an app for that. There's an app that can actually choose a verse for me. There's an app that can actually tell me what to read and when to read, and to tell me if I have done enough or haven't done enough, and so forth. And so they're non-traditional. Or you find that in churches today, that the pastor is not the primary voice in many contexts, for instance, preaching to people, that there are other voices that are delegated through the world that is connected to a globalized world, where people are listening to the pastor maybe less of in a small percentage of the time, but the bigger percentage is other voices. However, there is one other feature that I think forms our privatized world that is important for us as gospel communicators to be aware of, something that Raphael, who is in the call, would smile about, described by Charles Taylor, the philosopher, in his book, A Secular Age, which I believe is that existential map of our time. Now, in the book, Charles Taylor makes the claim that we live in a secular age, and the way that he uses this concept of secular is not to talk about the difference between, say, priests and money changers for the tax collectors, or a way in which today sometimes the term secular can describe, say, university space as a non-sectarian space for that matter. But he talks about how in a secular age, even our beliefs, we don't assume that our Christian beliefs are general, that we think of ourselves as having chosen a particular stance among a host of possibilities that attempt to compete or coexist in our world. So a truly pluralistic a context, but one where there's a coexistence, where fundamentalism under these conditions means that a stance that asserts itself as absolutely without recognizing itself as a stance is what we might call fundamentalism, that even an atheist can be fundamentalist under these terms. In a secular age, we understand that religious beliefs are an option amongst many, where religious beliefs are a choice. They're never assumed. We don't look down the road and assume that we understand what our neighbors believe automatically, which is something that has changed in the world, that our beliefs can be contested and are usually contested. And when he describes this world, is that on the one side, you've got this thing called transcendence. All right, those who believe in more than just the material world, that there's a transcendent reality, that it's not a closed system. The material world is not a closed system. And on the other side, you have this idea of immanence, that we can explain everything without recourse to transcendence. And of course, there's this tension in the world today where transcendence and immanence, they pull at opposite ends, but they bleed into one another. Faith is tough. If you talk to a lot of Christians today, They look into the world and they see so many, there's so much suffering. They see so many things that challenge them. There's so many conversations, particularly about social justice, about race, about identity, about belonging. And it's tough where people go, I wonder if what my eyes see defines all of reality. But if faith is tough, then the opposite is tougher. Because one looks at the world as well, and it is haunted, as Charles Taylor says, by transcendence, this idea that there is more. Again, people who don't necessarily define themselves as having a faith, or at least that's framed by immanence, looking at the world, looking at exactly the same thing, listening and participating in exactly the same conversations, and asking themselves, maybe there is something more than what my eyes can see. Maybe there is a sneaking suspicion that I might be missing something. It is Julian Barnes, the essayist, who captured that sense of that pressure where, if that describes this, that where faith is tough, the opposite is even tougher, when he said, I don't believe in God, but I miss him. I don't believe in God, but I miss him. And then thirdly, the mediatized world. A mediatized world is defined by, I guess, the information age, where information is created and is shared instantly, multi-directionally, interactively within almost unlimited reach, scope, and scale. And the media and information revolution, another revolution, therefore has created these network societies that often exist only virtually within, say, the cyberspace, or at least is amplified by the virtual. Talking about the social media revolution, that without traditional media to act as a gatekeeper, as has been a feature of the past, then the media sphere has somewhat been liberated through social media, creating new opportunities and a low bar of entry for individuals to contribute to agenda setting for discourses of any kind. One has to be on Twitter and to see that there's a low bar of entry, but that invites individuals to be able to contribute to different and various discourses. Now, many have embraced this media revolution as a means of liberalizing information, but it has often also opened the gates of unverified, false, and deliberately misleading information that shape public discourses, which leads to a conversation about information quality. And again, in the 21st century, these network societies rely so heavily on information that any direct or indirect usurpation of or discredit or a sense of a mutilation of that information it creates a new reality where concepts such as peace, such as truth, such as experience, such as even feelings for that matter, such as facts, have been redefined and have become subjective realities subject to public discourse. The one who shouts the loudest wins and gets to define the space. And then finally, the idea of information is power, where societal groups have used the developed public sphere to mobilize activists, potentially changing and challenging existing authority structures in very different societies, mostly in liberal societies. But the idea that those who control the narrative are powerful, and many of the stories that really get told by the media and in the way that they get told then eventually captures the imagination of the world and can set the agenda in the world, shifting things in various places. One has to think about this year, how this year started, for instance, with a huge focus on the pandemic, but the political agenda has been able to take shape and be able to almost worldwide be able to give everybody an interpretive lens into reading news events and certain events that are occurring across the globe. In John chapter 1, we read, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us, and we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." It's an exciting verse that has given so much a passion for me. This idea that that we get an imperative to preach the gospel because we believe the Christian story is true. I believe it is true. I believe that I have experienced the life-changing presence and power of God in my own life, but an invitation as well to go and participate with God in unveiling the beauty of God and God's story in a world that is broken, in a world that is hurting, in a world that is confused, in a world that is longing for God, that is longing for Jesus. But then not only to have this message to share and this invitation to share it, but to have also a model in how God did it. And the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. That in a globalized, privatized, mediatized world where there are multiple challenges for evangelism, that as fast as data and ideas can be shared, so can disinformation, so can conflict, so can the worst of our humanity be extroverted in various ways right across the world. That in a way that there are cross pressures, that even Christians ask the most interesting questions, showing the difficulties that they face when they think through the scriptures and try to think the backdrop of injustice as these scriptures and the history of Christianity developed. History of colonialism and empire, the history of Christianity itself being co-opted to sustain or to create and sustain injustices across the world. They themselves think, what do I have to offer that is relevant to a hurting world if I'm part of a story that has framed God unjustly in history and in the world? In the world where through mediatization, there is a contestation of the very basic concept that would otherwise bring relief and translate that into hope. What is the truth? What is true hope? And the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. There's an invitation that we can reimagine our reality, just like God did not sit outside and wait for or try to fix things from a distance, but he became born intimately in the mess that we had created. That there's an invitation for us as well to think through in this world, to really occupy a space. To everyone, everywhere is an invitation to occupy all the spaces that are available to us physically, as well as on a digital platform, wherever there is someone to reach, wherever somebody lives, for us as well to approach those spaces, to reimagine reality by sharing God's truth, to say, thy kingdom come. But then when we evangelize in a world that separates theory from practice, where information is thought only in a particular frame, that there is a way in which we look at Jesus Christ, who not only gave us our message, but also modeled how we ought to preach that message. Then we think about the different aspects of our gospel, the doctrinal, that we tell the world that God in Jesus Christ has enacted a salvation that we could not have on our own, that by our own merit we could not have achieved or even earned. But then that this message has a personal impact, that it changes values, it changes attitudes, it has a real impact on the personal lives of those to whom it takes root and begins to produce fruit. And also then to emphasize the social impact of this powerful message that we carry, that how we live is important, that what we believe should and does have an impact on how we live. And there's an invitation to participate with God on his mission to fix the cosmos, that it doesn't end on the doctrinal and the personal, but that there are real life consequences that therefore speak about the real power of the gospel to really shape our world and speak into the deep longings of our heart, the highest aspirations, the deep baseline narratives of our cultures today, the complexity of our social narratives, where there are not, that there is an invitation Jesus is the answer in a meaningful way. And then finally, I think there's an invitation here to think for ourselves, or rather to think and process through that in a world that is, again, very complex, that we are not to shy back, that as the church, just as we are invited to be salt and light, as the salt arrests decay and as light dispels darkness, that we carry a message that is meaningful, that can affect true change in hearts and attitudes, but in the real world, the outside world as well. And that we don't approach this with fear. In the Old Testament, you touched the leper, that you got unclean. In the New Testament, Jesus touches the leper, and it's the leper that gets clean. And so there is an invitation for us to be brave, that what this new world means, the strategic context that is very much powered by the digital and powered by the virtual and powered by new spaces and new domains that need us to live there, that we can go there with the confidence to go and preach that gospel to our contemporaries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Super encouraging to people who I know need that encouragement right now. And just to touch on your last point there, what advice would you give to an evangelist who doesn't feel brave right now?
Yeah, one of the most encouraging things is that we're not called to do this work alone. And there are people, as I mentioned, even on this particular call, who have had an impact on my own life and my own ministry, my own confidence in preaching the gospel. There are people who've encouraged me to go into places that traditionally I would not have considered going into. And I think that being in relationship, being in a community with other evangelists is a good start, because then the idea is that we can encourage one another. And of course, it does not mean we don't do so without fear. I think because of the message that we carry, because of the world that we live in, we have good reasons to have some reservations about going. But because of the greater imperative, but because of also the tools that we have in community, in the person of the Holy Spirit, we can definitely be much braver.
Yeah, that's great. And I encourage everyone to send in questions if you have them. We have 10 more minutes, so anything you've got, he's in the hot seat. In the beginning, you touched on that as a secular society, we don't believe that our beliefs are popular. And for me in Portland, Oregon, of someone who, I wouldn't say I'm an evangelist, but everyone's an evangelist, right? So I would love for you to touch on, even thinking about me, who's not a huge evangelist, how would you encourage someone who doesn't feel like their beliefs are popular in their city, is more scared to share their faith with people that they just come across who they know aren't Christians?
Yeah, so I believe that the one of the easiest things to do in our world today is to love people, to befriend people, and to love them, to hang out with them authentically, and to understand what goes on in their world. Often, I'm not sure about speaking to your particular context, but in some of the places where I've been here, there is a sense in which, because I've got an important message, or I understand is important, that sometimes I can do so without humility or without even humanizing the people that I want to speak to. In other words, the only thing that I think about is when I get into contact with them is I've got something to say to you, and I've got truth, and I've got to give it to you. Whereas there's a process where I can meet people and genuinely be interested in who they are and what they think and their stories that have shaped who they are, and also to learn how could I serve them. And I think in that kind of way, that I have the opportunity, therefore, to also live authentically with them in a way that could lead them to ask the question, like in 1 Peter 3:15, where people look and say, well, I realize that your passion, I realize that your life is defined by this passion. I realize that there's a certain hope that shapes your life. I realize that there is a reason behind that. Could you share that with me? I realize that you're a Christian, but since I've met you, and I'm talking about in my context, since I've met you, you've shown interest. You haven't been like some people who are just here to actually preach to me, but you're here to actually show interest, genuine interest. Obviously, I can see that you believe what you believe and you're passionate about it and you're not compromising about it. But I also noticed that you have taken an interest in me. That has also been a low barrier of entry as well, where we just genuinely befriend people and know them. So there are different types of different ways that we can engage in evangelism. But we've also, I saw some people here who are coming from Alpha, for instance, where the idea of gathering people around a meal and asking them questions around certain a presentation and aspects of the gospel that builds an accumulative case of the bigger story, where your role is to facilitate that whole evening, where you host the evening, where you preparing the meal, where you are with your generosity participating in their spiritual formation, being evangelized, where in that case you're partnering with other people and other groups and other material as well. There are ways in which you can also partner with people who are on the front lines. There may be some types of evangelists who are also, who will actually go to various places and you can be able to participate together. We can do different things together to make sure that that works as well, where through our finances, for instance, we can partner with evangelists who go. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there are so many ways where we can participate in the work of evangelism. And you're right, I think it's for everyone. Everybody should be participating in the work of evangelism.
Thank you. That's really good advice. Just focus on the relationship first and let Jesus, your life through Jesus, be shown to them. Bucky had a good question about, do you have advice for boldly and clearly sharing the gospel in places where Christians are persecuted while protecting the safety of those we're reaching or working with in ministry?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have a few guys in our team who are currently proclaiming the gospel in such contexts, and it's a really tough call for them. But it begins with them really being clear about the message and the impact of the message in their own lives. They're really fully convinced about what the gospel means and are passionate about preaching the gospel. But often we've had to be very wise in how we do it. We've had to think, for instance, I'll give an example. One of the guys reached out to me and said, look, if I were to gather the pastors or the preachers of the gospel in this particular region, and somebody were to hear of that meeting, somebody were to identify that church leaders are meeting in that particular context, then there's an opportunity for them to really take out the church in this particular, church leaders and preachers in this particular area with just one single attack, for instance. And so they were requesting, could we please, rather than do it face to face, could we organize ways in which we can get cell phones, for instance, and put micro SIM cards where content about evangelism and answering questions and even the gospel story, we can actually in a smart way put that in there. And in that way, all we have to do is try find a way to get those devices into the hands of the people who we're preaching to. So I guess there'll be different contexts, but the idea there is we've got to be creative in how we do it. Because there's a real threat and an opportunity that we could end up doing things in a ways that are not wise and that actually threaten and slow down the work that we are trying to do. But again, I want to emphasize that there are people who do this all the time. And the church, I mean, on one end, the church continues to grow because when we recognize that we are called to serve alongside other people and that we can learn from one another, then we realize that actually some of these strategies and things, there's some things that the Lord has given to us as a church. All we have to do is make sure that we are plugged into the wider church in order to access the resources that God has given us already.
Thank you. I want to do 2 more questions. I want to get to Sean's question, which I think is great for these times. How do we ensure that we don't compromise the message and purity of the gospel with our personal positions and ideas on issues of social justice and politics, etc.?
Yeah, good question. And I think it starts with us understanding that how we also approach the scriptures. We do so also with our own stories and our own context, that we ourselves are context when we read the scriptures, that we try our very best, of course, to make sure that the scriptures take centrality in defining for us what God's agenda is. And it's often helped me, for instance, to think, what is God's agenda? What is God's vision for the world? That even the gospel that we preach is not just God has a wonderful plan for my life, but God has a wonderful plan for the world. And thinking about these issues and I start with a biblical plot line, thinking, well, the Bible talks about creation, things good, shalom, describing this is the world that how God intended things to function. And then the fall is man's actions of rebellion causing God's world to have sin and to have decay. And then this redemption, the third part of the story, is God actually actively enacting that rescue mission. But this rescue mission is about redeeming the world and creating a new humanity. And so understanding the fall, what we lost, understanding creation, what God intended, and shalom helps us to understand redemption a bit better. And then, of course, there's this idea of restoration where Jesus is coming back to judge sin and then to remove pain and evil from his world, to purge his world of evil. And so if you understand the biblical plot line, then we are always reframing things according to the scriptures. So sociology has been very important, of course, in even helping us understand the scriptures, because in the New Testament, we get there and we go, what was happening in Corinthians? Who were these communities? What were they about? However, understanding and trying to always frame things from a theological point of view helps us then to keep within that space where the message stays, at least as best as we can, at the center. But also understanding that the history of the world there's a history of injustice, and God very much so has a heart for justice, and understanding what he expects of the faithful community, not just a universal covenant where he holds every single human being accountable, but there are definite imperatives and focuses on the worshiping and faithful community from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and then to try as best as we can to keep pace and in step with him in the world. I would then add this point, which maybe is my huge contribution here about community. We've got to make sure that we are reading the Bible not only with communities from our parts of the world, that we take advantage of a globalized world, and we make sure that, because this is a global story, that we read it with the global community, and where in our parts of the world there may be blind spots. For instance, you'll see that development of theology in many parts of the world, that there is often an exclusion of voices from certain parts of the world, and therefore that means that we're in danger of not seeing some of these gaps, or preaching strongly from our context, thinking that we're preaching a global message. But actually, there's a nuance that can be introduced by, again, being in community with others who are located in various parts of the world, our brothers and sisters in different parts of the world. that would be an important way of aggregating and making sure we stay as much as possible, with God's help, of course, on course.
Thank you. Let's just take one more minute for a quick question. You discussed 1 John 1:14, and I know so many people look up to you as an evangelist, so I would love for you to share an example of how you've modeled 1 John 1:14 in these days of craziness and upheaval.
One of the ways, for instance, that it's actually an amazing opportunity for preaching the gospel here in South Africa. A month ago, I got wind of some conversations that our national cricket team was really struggling to talk about some social narratives within the team, particularly race, racism, Black Lives Matter, transformation in sports, and so forth. That this was their conversation. I reached out to a friend who was involved in the process, and I said, I would love to help facilitate the way in which the team talks about this. And really, glory to God, I was given an opportunity to lead a process for our national team where I was responsible for shaping and setting the agenda on how these very, as you know, very often divisive, often charged, often polarizing and words and themes, particularly. And it was incredible because I had the opportunity to shape it. Again, the way I shaped it was to talk about how Jesus spoke about issues. So even today, like for instance, to talk about Jesus and Zacchaeus, to say there was a way in which they had a conversation. There was a way in which Jesus treated somebody that produced a change, that we don't always have to relate in a particular way that the world tells us that is common in the public space. And in that sense, what I was just trying to do is show them, and by modeling using Jesus's way of dealing and talking to people, I was trying to show them that there is something desirable about the person of Jesus. There's something desirable about the ways of Jesus. And of course, by the time some of them then begin to ask me, tell me more about Jesus, to say he's not just an ethical teacher, he's not just a great conversationalist or somebody who restores dignity, but there is a way in which he restores full humanity when our humanity has been marred and scarred by our sin and other people's sin. Here's an invitation to follow Jesus. However, it really took a sense in which I had to work very hard to get into a space that wasn't very comfortable, but to really begin to translate myself, to speak the language of on-field identity and team culture and what is a winning culture and that sort of thing, but to really move into, as Eugene Peterson says when he speaks about that scripture, to move into the neighborhood. And so there was a place where I felt I needed to move into that neighborhood. It was not my field. It was not my neighborhood, so to speak, where that was native to me. But I felt God helped me to really adapt, to really be able to proclaim the gospel in a space that traditionally would not be open to the gospel. And seeing so many of the young men responding to the gospel invitation was, of course, the extreme pleasure here.